Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, I'd really appreciate it if you could use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a huge difference for us as well. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you enjoy these stories, consider subscribing. It means everything. Now let me tell you about something that happened during what should have been the most forgettable night of my professional life. The transfer window. I never believed in fate, coincidence, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I still don't, actually. But I do believe that some moments have weight to them that you can't measure until long after they've passed. This is about one of those moments, though calling it a moment doesn't quite capture what it was. A pause, maybe. A gap. A window that opened between the seconds and showed me something I wasn't meant to see. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I did for work back then, which was essentially nothing important. I was a contractor, the kind of temporary worker that large organisations hire when they need an extra pair of hands, but don't want the commitment of an actual employee. My job that night was pure administrative tedium, data verification for a logistics company that managed warehousing systems across the Midwest. The kind of work that requires a security clearance simply because you have access to proprietary systems, not because anything you're doing is remotely sensitive. The shift was overnight, 11 in the evening until 7 in the morning, at a regional processing centre outside of Columbus, Ohio. The building itself was exactly what you'd expect. A converted warehouse with one section retrofitted into offices, all industrial carpets and fluorescent lights that hummed just loud enough to notice if you paid attention. Most of the permanent staff worked days. Night shift was me, 2 security guards who stayed in the lobby, and occasionally a cleaning crew that came through around 3 in the morning. I'd been there for 5 nights already. The work was mind-numbing but easy. I'd sit at a terminal in a small office on the 2nd floor, review batch logs from the day's inventory transfers, flag inconsistencies, and forward everything to the main system for processing. Each night took about 6 hours of actual work, with an hour for breaks and an hour of buffer time built in. The company paid well for overnight work, and I needed the money. Simple as that. Nothing about the job suggested I was doing anything other than exactly what I'd been hired for. There were no restricted areas I couldn't access, no conversations that stopped when I walked into break rooms, no sense that anything unusual happened in that building. It was aggressively ordinary, the kind of place where the biggest drama was probably someone microwaving fish in the staff kitchen. But on the 6th night, something changed. Chapter 1. The unscheduled delay. The shift started normally. I badged in at the front desk, exchanged nods with Marcus, the security guard I'd gotten used to seeing, and took the stairs up to the 2nd floor. My office, or rather the office I'd been assigned, was at the end of a long corridor, past a series of conference rooms that were never used at night. The door was always unlocked. Inside, 1 desk, 1 computer terminal, 1 office chair that squeaked if you leaned back, and nothing else except a dying potted plant someone had abandoned. I logged into the system at exactly 11:03. The interface was dated but functional, the kind of software that had probably been built in the early 2000s and maintained just enough to keep working. Green text on black background, simple command inputs, batch files organised by date and facility code. I pulled up the day's logs and started working through them. Everything proceeded normally until around 4:15 in the morning. I was halfway through a particularly large batch cross-referencing manifest codes with physical inventory counts when the system simply stopped responding. Not crashed, not frozen in the traditional sense, it just paused. The cursor kept blinking. The timestamp in the corner kept updating. But the data I was reviewing wouldn't advance, and none of my inputs registered. My first thought was that I'd been disconnected from the server. I checked the network status indicator in the corner of the screen. Connected. Strong signal. No error messages. I tried logging out and back in. The logout command didn't execute. The screen remained exactly as it was, showing the same batch file, the same entry, like the entire system had decided to take a breath and hold it. Sat back assuming it was a temporary hiccup. Server delays happened. Maybe there was maintenance I hadn't been told about. Maybe someone else was accessing the same files. I gave it 2 minutes, then 5. The cursor kept blinking its steady rhythm. The clock kept counting forward, but nothing else moved. At the 10-minute mark, I started to feel the first edge of unease. Not because anything was wrong exactly, but because nothing was triggering the way it should when something goes wrong. No error messages, no system alerts, no timeout warnings. The computer was functioning perfectly while accomplishing absolutely nothing. I picked up the desk phone to call the IT helpline number I'd been given during orientation. The line was active, but when I dialed, I got a strange tone I didn't recognise. Not busy, not disconnected. Just a steady, low tone that continued without variation. I hung up and tried again. Same result. The delay stretched to 15 minutes, then 20. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the parking lot. My car sat alone under one of the sodium lights. Everything outside looked exactly as it should at 4:30 in the morning, quiet and still and empty. When I returned to the desk, the screen hadn't changed, but the quality of the pause had shifted somehow. It no longer felt like a glitch. It felt like waiting, like something was taking its time, moving through a process that required this specific duration of stillness. I didn't have a word for it then, but looking back, I'd call it intentional. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was occupied. Chapter 2. The first inconsistency. At the 30-minute mark, data started appearing on the screen, not all at once, gradually, like water seeping through fabric, numbers populating fields that had been empty, timestamps updating themselves, entries I'd flagged earlier unmarking themselves and shifting to different categories. I watched hands motionless on the keyboard as the system corrected itself, or rather, as something corrected the system. The changes weren't random. They followed a logic I could almost perceive. Patterns within patterns, like watching someone else solve a puzzle that had been giving you trouble. A manifest entry I'd questioned earlier, a shipment of industrial equipment with a weight discrepancy, resolved itself. The weight corrected from £4,000 to £6,000. But when I scrolled up to check the original entry, the logs now showed £6,000 had been there all along. The timestamp on my original flag remained, but the flag itself no longer pointed to anything wrong. Another entry appeared completely new, with a timestamp from 2 days prior, a routine transfer between facilities. Except I'd reviewed those logs. I'd gone through every single entry from that date. This one hadn't existed. I checked the audit trail, the record of every change made to the database. It showed my login, my review process, the system's automatic validations, but no record of these corrections. No indication that anything had been modified. The data presented itself as if it had always been this way, as if my memory of seeing it differently was the error. My hands started to sweat. I saved my work, backed up the files, and tried again to log out. This time, the command processed. The screen went black, then returned to the login prompt. I didn't log back in immediately. I sat there staring at the empty screen, trying to rationalise what I'd seen. Cached data that hadn't updated properly. a synchronization delay between local and server copies, a quirk of the software I didn't understand because I'd only been trained on the basics. All reasonable explanations, none of them felt right. When I finally logged back in, everything appeared normal. The batch file I'd been working on was complete, marked as reviewed and forwarded. According to the system, I'd finished it at 4:17, just 2 minutes after the delay had started. 50 minutes of sitting and waiting, compressed into 2 minutes of recorded time. The timestamp on the computer matched the timestamp on my phone. I hadn't lost time, the system had, or gained it. I sat very still listening to the building around me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of the HVAC system cycling. Nothing else. No footsteps in the hall, no voices, no indication that anyone else was aware that anything unusual had happened. I pulled up the next batch file and continued working. What else was I going to do? But I kept glancing at the clock, watching for another pause, another gap where things didn't quite line up. It came again at 5:08. Same pattern. The system stopped accepting input, but continued functioning. This time, I was ready. I opened a text file on the side and started documenting everything I could see. Timestamp when it started, active processes, network status, everything. The delay lasted 11 minutes. During that time, 3 entries modified themselves in the background. Not errors being corrected, I realised. Adjustments being made, small changes to routing codes, facility assignments, processing priorities, the kind of changes that would go unnoticed unless you were specifically looking for them, and maybe not even then. When the system resumed, my documentation file was gone. Not deleted, simply not there. Like I'd never opened it. I tried to recreate it, opened a new file, started typing, got 3 sentences in before everything paused again. This time, I didn't wait at the desk. I stood up and walked out into the hallway. Chapter 3. The room that wasn't on the map. The corridor was empty, lit by every third fluorescent panel to save energy during overnight hours. The pattern of light and shadow made the familiar hallway look slightly foreign, like a stage set recreating a place I knew rather than the place itself. I'd walked this corridor a dozen times over the past week. 2nd floor offices, east wing, conference rooms on the left, administrative offices on the right, emergency exit at the far end. Simple layout, impossible to get lost. But when I reached the corner where the hallway turned toward the stairwell, I noticed a door I didn't remember seeing before. It wasn't hidden or marked as restricted. Just a standard office door, same as all the others, with a small rectangular window at eye level and a plain metal handle. No nameplate, no room number, no signage of any kind. I'd definitely walked past this spot before, multiple times. I couldn't swear there hadn't been a door there, but I also couldn't recall specifically noticing one. That's the thing about familiar places. You stop seeing them in detail. You navigate by expectation rather than observation. I approached slowly, aware of how quiet everything was. My footsteps on the industrial carpet made almost no sound. Through the small window, I could see that the lights inside were on, casting the same fluorescent glow as the hallway. The door was unlocked. I should have gone back to my desk, should have returned to work and pretended I hadn't seen anything unusual. But something about the timing felt connected to the system delays, to the modifications I'd witnessed. This wasn't random. It was part of the same event. Whatever that event was, I pushed the door open. The room was smaller than the standard offices, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet. No windows, no desk or furniture of any kind. Just empty floor space and bare walls painted the same institutional beige as every other room in the building. Except it wasn't quite empty. In the centre of the room, taking up maybe a third of the floor space, was something I still struggled to describe. accurately. Chapter 4. The object that refuses description. Calling it an object feels inadequate, but I don't have better language. It wasn't clearly mechanical, though there were aspects that suggested precision engineering. It wasn't organic, though it had a quality of coherence that felt almost biological. The closest comparison I can make is to describe it as a presence that happened to have physical properties. The size was difficult to judge. From one angle, it seemed roughly cubic, maybe 4 feet on each side. From another angle, it appeared flatter, more like a panel or screen. The shape didn't change exactly, but the way my eyes registered it shifted depending on where I stood. The surface, if you can call it that, didn't reflect light normally. It wasn't dark or light, it was something else, like the visual equivalent of white noise. My eyes would try to focus on a specific section and find nothing to lock onto. No texture, no colour variation, no reference points. But the strangest thing was the light around it. The fluorescent panels above cast the same harsh illumination they did everywhere else in the building, but near the object, the light behaved differently. It didn't dim exactly. It bent. It curved around the space the object occupied, creating a subtle distortion that made the rest of the room look slightly warped. I took a step closer. Sound immediately muffled, like someone had wrapped cotton around my ears. Not silent, but dampened. I could still hear the building's ambient hum, but it felt distant, filtered through something I couldn't see. The air temperature hadn't changed. There was no smell, no vibration, no electromagnetic interference with my phone when I checked it. Every measurable quality of the environment remained normal, but the space itself felt occupied in a way that had nothing to do with simple, physical displacement. I circled around it slowly, staying a few feet away. The object didn't move, didn't emit sound, didn't respond to my presence in any detectable way. But it also didn't feel inert. There was activity happening, I was certain of that. Something was occurring within or around it, a process I couldn't perceive directly, but could sense the way you can sense someone standing behind you, even when you can't see them. I reached out my hand, stopping a few inches from the surface. Not because I felt any resistance or danger, but because some instinct told me that touching it would be crossing a threshold I wasn't prepared for. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a notification. System message from the company network. Processing delay resolved. Please resume normal operations. I checked the time. 5:23. I'd been in the room for less than 3 minutes, though it felt much longer. When I looked back at the object, it appeared exactly the same, but the quality of the presence had shifted. Before, it had felt neutral, indifferent to my observation. Now it felt aware, not of me specifically perhaps, but aware that it was being observed. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the space where the object occupied reality in its strange, undefined way. As I reached the threshold and stepped back into the hallway, the sound rushed back to normal volume. The light straightened itself. Everything snapped back into ordinary physics. I pulled the door closed and stood there for a moment, breathing carefully, trying to organise my thoughts into something coherent. Behind me, a voice said, "Did you find what you were looking for?" Chapter 5. The realisation of timing. I spun around to find a woman I'd never seen before standing about 10 feet away in the hallway. She wore business casual clothes, slacks and a polo shirt with the company logo, and carried a tablet under one arm. Mid-40s maybe, with short hair and the kind of relaxed posture that suggested she belonged here. "I'm sorry," I managed. "You looked lost," she said, gesturing vaguely down the hallway. "I saw you standing out here. Everything okay?" My mind raced. How long had she been watching? Had she seen me come out of the room? Yeah, fine, just stretching my legs. Long shift. She nodded sympathetically. Tell me about it. I'm covering for someone in facilities management. Pipe issue in the basement level. You're the temp working data verification, right? Right, I said, trying to place when I would have been introduced to her. I didn't remember seeing her during orientation or any of my previous shifts. Well, if you need anything, I'll be downstairs for another hour or so, hopefully getting this leak sorted. She started walking past me, then paused. Oh, and Marcus mentioned the IT system was acting weird earlier. If you're having trouble with your terminal, it should be stable now. Some kind of server synchronization thing. She continued down the hallway and disappeared around the corner before I could respond. I turned back to look at the door to the room. It was still there, still unmarked, still unremarkable. I tried the handle again, still unlocked. I opened it slowly, half expecting to find an ordinary storage room or electrical closet that I'd somehow misremembered. The object was gone. The room was completely empty. Same dimensions, same beige walls, same fluorescent lighting, but the space in the centre where the object had been was just empty floor, showing slight wear patterns in the linoleum that suggested nothing unusual had ever occupied that spot. I stepped inside and walked to where the object had been. No temperature differential, no distortion of light, no muffled sound. Just an empty room that could have been used for storage or meetings or anything else mundane and forgettable. I crouched down and examined the floor. No marks, no residue, no indication that anything had been there. I stood up and checked my phone again. The system message was still there, time-stamped at 5:23. Something clicked in my mind. I opened the message and read it more carefully. Processing delay resolved. Please resume normal operations. Not processing complete. Not system error fixed. Delay resolved. I pulled up the timestamps from the system delays I'd experienced. 4:15, 5:08, 5:23. Then I checked the time I'd entered the room with the object. 5:20. Give or take a minute. The delays coincided with the object's presence. Or maybe more accurately, the object appeared during the delays. The system would pause, reality would make space for something that didn't quite fit normal parameters, and when I stopped looking directly at it, when my attention moved elsewhere, the system would resume. But when I came back, when I walked into that room and put my full attention on it, everything had paused again. The object had synchronized with observation. I left the room and closed the door behind me, walked back to my office with careful measured steps, sat down at the terminal and stared at the screen. The batch file I'd been working on earlier showed as complete, all entries reviewed, all inconsistencies resolved, all data forwarded to the central system. According to the logs, I'd maintained steady productivity throughout the night, with only 2 brief pauses that fell within normal parameters for breaks. No record of the extended delays. No indication that anything unusual had occurred. I worked through the rest of my shift in a kind of numb automation, processing the remaining batch files without really seeing them. At 6:45, I logged out, gathered my things, and headed downstairs. Marcus was still at the security desk, looking tired but alert. Quiet night? He asked as I signed out. Yeah, I said. Real quiet. That's the way we like it. He smiled and went back to his phone. I drove home in the early morning light, the roads mostly empty, my mind running through everything I'd seen and trying to organise it into something that made sense. I couldn't. The pieces fit together in terms of sequence, but the underlying logic escaped me. What I'd witnessed didn't connect to anything in my understanding of how the world worked. It wasn't that I didn't believe it had happened. I knew it had, but I didn't have a framework to put it in. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote down everything I could remember. Every detail, every timestamp, every sensation. Then I saved the file in 3 different locations and tried to get some sleep. I had 4 more shifts scheduled at that building. I wasn't sure if I wanted to complete them or call in sick and never go back. In the end, I went back, because I needed to know if it would happen again. Chapter 6. The witness who wasn't supposed to be there. The 7th night started the same as the previous 6. I arrived at 10:50, badged in, climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, and settled into my assigned office. Marcus was at the security desk again. No sign of the facilities manager I'd encountered the night before. I'd spent the previous day researching the building's history, the company's background, anything that might explain what I'd experienced. I found nothing unusual. Standard commercial property, built in the early 90s, renovated twice, currently leased to a logistics firm that had an unremarkable safety record and no history of complaints or incidents. Just another piece of Midwest commercial real estate. The work proceeded normally until 3:47, when the system executed its first delay. I was ready this time. I'd brought a notebook, the old-fashioned paper kind that couldn't be digitally erased. The moment the terminal stopped accepting input, I started writing. Timestamp, active processes, network status, everything observable. The delay lasted 8 minutes. No modifications to the data this time. Just the pause, the stillness, the sense of something moving through processes I couldn't see. When the system resumed, I immediately checked the 2nd floor. Hallway. The door to the empty room was there, same as before. I approached it carefully, listening for any sound, watching for any movement. The hallway was empty. The building's ambient sounds continued normally. I opened the door. The object was back, occupying the same approximate space, presenting the same indefinable characteristics. Light bending around it, sound muffling near it, the presence that suggested activity without movement. This time, I stayed in the doorway, not entering the room fully. I watched it the way you'd watch a sleeping animal, alert for any change, any response to my presence. The air pressure shifted, not dramatically, just a subtle change like when someone opens a door in a sealed room. I turned to find a man standing behind me, in the hallway, staring past me into the room. He was younger than me, maybe late 20s, wearing the same kind of business casual clothes that seemed to be standard for after-hours staff. He held a clipboard and had a radio clipped to his belt. "What the hell is that?" he said. I stepped aside to give him a clearer view. "You can see it?" "See what? The equipment?" He moved closer, squinting into the room. "I got called up here about some kind of climate control issue. Is that the new HVAC unit they were installing?" I looked back into the room. The object was still there, unchanged. "What do you see exactly?" He gave me an odd look. "What do you mean?" "It's just the AC unit. Big square thing." "Why, what do you see?" "Same thing," I lied. "Just making sure we're looking at the same equipment." He walked into the room, moving directly toward the object without hesitation. I fought the urge to grab his arm and pull him back. He stopped about 2 feet away from it and examined something on his clipboard. "Yeah, this is the unit they mentioned. Supposed to check the airflow readings." He pulled a small device from his pocket, something that looked like a thermometer, held it up near the object. From my angle, he appeared to be holding it directly into the space the object occupied, but he showed no awareness of anything unusual, no reaction to the distorted light, the muffled sound, the presence that filled the room. "Readings are normal," he said, making a note on his clipboard. "Temperature's stable, humidity's fine." He turned back to me. "You been having any issues with the climate control in your office?" "No," I said carefully. "Everything's been fine." "Good. That's what we like to hear. He walked past me back into the hallway, already focused on his clipboard again. If you notice anything weird, just call the facilities line. We're on until 6. He disappeared down the corridor, radio crackling briefly with some kind of dispatch message. I stood in the doorway, looking at the object that he'd just walked around, examined, interacted with, while seeing something completely different. The realization settled into my chest with a cold certainty. Perception wasn't shared equally. Whatever this was, it didn't present the same face to everyone who encountered it. It showed people what they were prepared to see, what fit within their expectations. For the HVAC technician, it was equipment, mundane, explicable, part of the building's normal infrastructure. For me, it was something else, something undefined because I didn't have the context to define it. My mind couldn't categorize it, so it remained raw and strange and impossible to look away from. I wondered what would happen if someone with different expectations encountered it. Would they see something else entirely? Would a physicist see equations made manifest? Would a child see a toy? Would a priest see something divine? The object hadn't changed. We had changed around it, each observer creating their own interface with whatever it actually was. I closed the door and returned to my office. The system delay had ended while I was in the hallway. According to the timestamp, I had lost 4 minutes of recorded time, though the actual duration felt much longer. I pulled up the batch files and continued working, but my attention kept drifting to the question of what the object was showing itself as to different observers. And the darker question beneath that, if it could modify perception this precisely, what else could it modify? Chapter 7. The End of the Window. The 8th night, I arrived with a plan. I'd purchased a small digital camera, the kind with manual controls and the ability to shoot in low light. My thinking was simple. If I couldn't trust my own perception, maybe I could capture something more objective. A photograph wouldn't be subject to the same perceptual filtering. I set the camera on my desk, angled toward the hallway, through the office's open door. If the delay started again, if the room appeared, I'd have documentation. The night proceeded without incident until 4:32. The system paused mid-entry, that familiar stillness settling over everything. I grabbed the camera and moved into the hallway. The door was there, as expected. I photographed it from multiple angles. The exterior, the hallway context, the unremarkable door handle. Then I opened it. The object occupied the centre of the room, same as before. I raised the camera and looked through the viewfinder. Through the lens, the object appeared as a dark mass, like an area of underexposure that the camera's sensors couldn't compensate for. Not black exactly. Absent. A gap in the image where something should be but wasn't registering. I took several photographs, adjusting the exposure settings, trying different angles. The camera clicked and whirred, storing images that I already suspected would show nothing useful. As I lowered the camera, the object's presence shifted. The quality of the air changed, became heavier. The distortion of light intensified, and for just a moment, I felt like I was looking at it more clearly, seeing past whatever interface it had been presenting. It wasn't an object at all. It was an absence, a space where something had been removed from reality, creating a void that the world was trying to fill. The light bent because it was avoiding empty space. Sound muffled because there was nothing there to carry it properly. And in that absence, something else was moving. Not moving through it, but moving it. Using the void as a conduit, as a doorway, as a transfer point between wherever it actually existed and this temporary access point it had created. The moment of clarity lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then my brain reasserted its normal processing, and the object returned to being inexplicable rather than impossible. I backed out of the room, camera clutched in my hands, and stood in the hallway, trying to calm my breathing. Without warning, the quality of the delay changed. The stillness broke. The system resumed. I felt it happen the way you feel air pressure normalise after a thunderstorm. I turned back to look into the room. It was empty, completely ordinary. No object, no distortion, no presence. Just an unused room with scuffed linoleum and fluorescent lights. I took a photograph of the empty room, then closed the door and returned to my office. The terminal showed my work as current. All batch files processed normally. I checked the camera's memory card and scrolled through the images I'd just taken. The photographs of the hallway and the door were there, perfectly normal. The photographs from inside the room showed only an empty space. No dark mass, no absence, no distortion. Just an ordinary room that could have been a storage closet or a small office. The only indication that anything unusual had occurred was the timestamp on the photos, which showed a longer duration than the system logs recorded. 3 minutes of photographs compressed into 45 seconds of official time. I saved the images anyway and continued working. The rest of the shift passed without incident. When my replacement arrived at 7, a regular employee I'd seen a few times in passing, I asked casually if there had been any issues with the building systems recently. "Not that I know of," she said, settling into the chair I'd just vacated. "Why, did you run into problems?" "Just some brief delays," I said. "Nothing major. It said it was server synchronization." "Yeah, that happens sometimes. Usually clears up on its own." She logged in and pulled up the day's first batch file, already focused on her work. I left the building and sat in my car for a while, watching the sunrise paint the parking lot in shades of orange and gold. I had 2 more shifts scheduled. After that, the contract ended, and I'd move on to whatever temporary assignment came next. Part of me wanted to call in sick, to walk away and never think about what I'd seen again. But another part, a stronger part, wanted to know if it would happen one more time. If I'd get another chance to understand what I'd witnessed. I went back for the 9th night. Chapter 8. The official explanation. The 9th and 10th nights passed without incident. The system functioned normally. No delays, no modifications, no pauses. I worked through the batch files with steady efficiency, finished each shift on time, and left without encountering anything unusual. On the final night, as I was signing out, Marcus handed me an envelope. "Hey, before you go, someone from HR left this for you earlier." Inside was a standard form letter thanking me for my service, confirming that the temporary assignment had been completed satisfactorily, and providing contact information if I needed documentation for future employment. Attached to it was a brief incident report. The report, dated from my 6th night, described a minor systems malfunction that had caused brief processing delays between the hours of 4 and 6 in the morning. The issue had been identified as a synchronization conflict between local and server databases, resolved through automated error correction protocols. No data had been lost or compromised. All affected systems had been verified and cleared for continued operation. The language was bureaucratic and thorough, the kind of explanation that covered all the technical bases while revealing nothing about what had actually happened. It was simultaneously accurate and completely inadequate. I checked the signature line. Someone from the IT department I'd never met, confirming that the issue had been investigated and resolved. No further action required. There was no mention of the room, no acknowledgement of anything beyond a routine technical problem that fell well within normal operational parameters. I folded the papers and put them back in the envelope. "Everything good?" Marcus asked. "Yeah," I said. "All good." "Well, it was nice having you around. Quiet, competent. That's what we like in overnight temps." He smiled and went back to his crossword puzzle. I drove home in the pre-dawn darkness, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat beside me. When I got home, I filed it with the photographs and my handwritten notes, creating a small collection of evidence that proved nothing. Over the next few weeks, I received my final payment, completed the necessary paperwork, and moved on to a new contract at a different company. Life continued normally. No one contacted me about the incident. No one asked follow-up questions or requested additional information. The official explanation stood unchallenged. A minor systems issue investigated and resolved. Case closed, except it wasn't closed, not for me. Chapter 9. Connecting the dots. I couldn't let it go. Not because I was obsessed or traumatised, but because what I'd experienced was too specific, too structured to be random. The delays, the room, the object, the differential perception, all of it followed a pattern that suggested deliberate design rather than accident. I started researching quietly, using public records and online forums, looking for anything similar. I avoided the obvious conspiracy theory sites and focused on more mundane sources: employment forums, contractor message boards, industrial incident databases. What I found was a pattern of absences, not evidence, but gaps where evidence should be. Reports of system delays at logistics facilities, typically overnight, typically lasting between 5 and 30 minutes, always explained as routine technical issues, always resolved without further investigation. Contractors reassigned or not renewed after short-term positions, nothing unusual about the separations themselves, but a higher than expected turnover rate in certain facilities during certain time periods. Building renovations and equipment installations that created temporary spaces, rooms that existed briefly during construction phases before being incorporated into permanent layouts or removed entirely. None of it proved anything. All of it could be explained by normal business operations, but the pattern was there if you looked for it. Temporary workers in temporary spaces, experiencing temporary anomalies that left no permanent record. I found 3 references in contractor forums to weird delays during overnight shifts. The posts were casual, throwaway comments in larger discussions about frustrating work experiences. None of them described anything like what I'd seen, but the timing matched. 2 at logistics facilities, 1 at a data centre, all overnight, all described as brief system pauses that resolved themselves. I tried contacting the users who'd posted those comments. 1 account was deleted, 1 never responded. The 3rd wrote back saying they didn't remember making that post and must have been complaining about normal IT issues. The more I searched, the more I recognised the pattern. Not a cover-up exactly, just a kind of systematic forgetting, a way of incorporating anomalies into normal operations so smoothly that they stopped being remarkable. I wondered how many other people had seen what I'd seen, how many had stood in that room, or rooms like it, had watched something that refused to be categorised and then filed it away as unexplainable and therefore not worth pursuing. The answer, I suspected, was more than anyone would guess and fewer than would matter. Because here's what I'd realised. The phenomenon, whatever it was, didn't care about being discovered. It wasn't hiding exactly. It was operating in spaces where discovery didn't matter, where witnesses were temporary and evidence was ephemeral, and official explanations were sufficient to close the case. It was using the gaps in our systems, the overnight hours when fewer people were present, the transition periods during installations and renovations, the moments when attention was divided and perception was malleable. And it was working with infrastructure, not people. The The system delays weren't targeting individuals, they were coordinating with processes, synchronizing with data flows, interacting with the machinery of logistics and information in ways that we were simply obstacles to. We weren't being contacted, we were being tolerated, briefly, politely, the way you might tolerate a housefly that happened to be in the room when you were doing something important. Not a threat, not a partner, just something to work around until it left on its own. Chapter 10. The Theory. I developed a hypothesis, though calling it a theory feels too formal for something I can't prove and wouldn't know how to test. The phenomenon doesn't travel through space the way we understand travel. It doesn't cross distances or navigate geography. Instead, it appears during transition states, moments when systems are processing, updating, synchronizing. When data is being transferred between locations, when infrastructure is being modified, when there's a pause in normal operations, those moments create a kind of gap, a temporary space between one state and another. And in that gap, something else can exist briefly, can move through, can interact with our infrastructure in ways that leave minimal traces. Think about it. Every digital system has delays built into it. Loading times, processing queues, buffer periods. We accept them as normal parts of how technology functions. But what if some of those delays aren't just processing time? What if they're windows, brief openings where something else is using the same infrastructure for purposes we can't perceive? The object I saw, the presence in that room, wasn't a physical craft or device. It was an interface point, a place where the gap between states became visible because the synchronization wasn't perfect, because I happened to be looking at the right moment in the right way. The differential perception makes sense in this context. If the phenomenon operates in transition states, it would need to present differently to different observers depending on their frame of reference, their expectations, their ability to process what they're seeing. It's not deception, it's translation. Showing each observer a version they can incorporate into their understanding without breaking their worldview. For the HVAC technician, it was equipment because that's what he was there to see. His framework was building maintenance, so the phenomenon presented as a building maintenance issue. For me, with no specific framework to impose, it remained undefined. Strange but not impossible, observable but not categorizable. For the systems themselves, it was probably something else entirely: data structures, processing protocols, authorization sequences, a language of interaction that had nothing to do with physical presence. The implications are unsettling. If this is real, if this is happening regularly, then our infrastructure is being used by something we don't control and barely perceive. Not invaded exactly, shared. We're running our logistics and data systems on the same substrate that something else is using for its own purposes, and we're just obstacles, temporary inconveniences that occasionally notice something strange but can't prove it and eventually move on. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it comes from, or what it's doing, or whether it's aware of us as anything more than background processes that sometimes get in the way, but I know it's there. In the gaps, in the delays, in the moments when everything pauses and you're not sure why. Epilogue. Waiting for the next delay. That was 3 years ago. Since then, I've worked probably 50 different contract positions. Warehouses, offices, data centres, processing facilities. I've logged thousands of hours of overnight shifts, watched thousands of system delays, experienced hundreds of moments when time seemed to stretch or compress or simply pause. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be: normal technical operations, mundane processing delays, the ordinary friction of digital infrastructure doing its work, but some of them feel different, familiar, like I'm recognising a pattern I've encountered before. An elevator that stops between floors for exactly 17 seconds before continuing. A loading screen that hangs at 94% for longer than the previous 93% combined. A network connection that drops and reconnects with a momentary pause that feels weighted, intentional. I've learned to recognise the quality of these moments. It's subtle, almost subliminal. A kind of stillness that's different from ordinary waiting. A sense that something is moving through a process I can't see, and I just happen to be present while it completes. I don't investigate anymore. I don't take photographs or write detailed notes or try to find the rooms where the transfer points might be. I learned that lesson. The phenomenon operates in spaces where investigation doesn't matter, where evidence doesn't persist, where witnesses don't stay long enough to develop a comprehensive case. But I notice, I pay attention, and I've started to develop an instinct for when the delays matter versus when they're just delays. There's no fear involved. That's the strange part. You'd think encountering evidence of something that operates beyond normal understanding would be terrifying, but it's not. It's more like being let in on a secret that doesn't really concern you. You're aware of something larger operating in the background, but it's not hostile, and it's not interested in you specifically. You're just there, temporarily, taking up space in a system that's being used for purposes you can't fully comprehend. Sometimes, I wonder if other people have developed the same awareness. If there are other overnight workers, other temporary contractors, other people who've stood in the gaps and recognised what they were seeing. We'd have no way to find each other, no common language to describe what we'd experienced. But maybe we pass each other sometimes, in lobbies or parking lots or break rooms, and recognise something in the way the other person pauses during a system delay. A moment of shared understanding that doesn't need to be spoken. I think about the transfer window. That's what I call it now. The brief opening when something crosses from wherever it exists normally into the infrastructure we've built, uses it for whatever purpose it has, and crosses back before we can document or measure or prove that it was there. How often does it happen? I don't know. Probably more than we'd guess. Probably less than would change anything about how we live our lives. But it's there. In the pauses, in the delays, in the moments when you're waiting for something to load and time seems to stretch just a little longer than it should. Most of the time, it's nothing. Just a busy server, a congested network, a routine processing queue. But sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you're in the right place, with the right kind of awareness, you can feel it. The window opening, something moving through, and then just as quickly closing again, leaving you standing there unchanged, with nothing to prove and everything to know. The system resumes, the elevator arrives, the screen loads, life continues, and you go back to work carrying the knowledge that somewhere in the gaps between moments, between states, between what we can measure and what we can prove, something else is operating. Not hiding, not revealing itself, just existing. In the spaces we create but don't occupy, in the transfer window, waiting for the next delay.
The signal in the gravel road. Some encounters don't announce themselves with bright lights in the sky or hovering saucers above cornfields. Some arrive quietly during the most ordinary moments of our lives, when we're tired and thinking about nothing more profound than getting home. What follows is an account that defies easy categorization, not because it's sensational, but because it's disturbingly mundane in its beginning and incomprehensible in its conclusion. This is the story of someone who took a wrong turn on a rural back road and discovered that the universe operates on rules we've barely begun to understand. Just another drive home. The evening shift at the distribution centre ended like every other, with sore feet, a stiff back, and the vague satisfaction of another day's work completed. It was late October, that strange in-between time when autumn refuses to fully commit to winter, but the warmth of summer feels like a distant memory. The parking lot was nearly empty by the time the narrator reached their car, just a handful of vehicles scattered under the yellow security lights that hummed with that distinctive electric buzz. The drive home usually took 35 minutes via the main highway, a straight shot through commercial districts and residential neighbourhoods, with traffic lights at predictable intervals. But tonight, construction barrels and detour signs redirected traffic onto a series of rural back roads that cut through farmland and conservation areas. The narrator had driven this route once or twice before, years ago, and remembered it being peaceful if somewhat longer. The detour added maybe 10 minutes to the trip, but at this hour, with no other cars on the road, it felt almost meditative. The asphalt gave way to packed gravel after the first few turns, and the streetlights disappeared entirely. High beams became necessary as the road narrowed, flanked on both sides by tall grass that swayed gently in the night breeze. Occasionally, the headlights would catch the reflection of animal eyes in the darkness. Deer, probably, or maybe raccoons. There was nothing unusual about any of this. No strange weather patterns, no unexplained lights, no sense of foreboding. Just a tired person driving home on a quiet night, thinking about leftover pasta in the refrigerator and whether there was enough time to watch an episode of something before bed. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show discussing municipal politics with a kind of dry earnestness that made for perfect background noise. Then came the gravel line. At first it barely registered as noteworthy. Just a perfectly straight line of disturbed stones running parallel to the tyre tracks, slightly darker than the surrounding road surface. The kind of thing a road grading vehicle might leave behind, or perhaps some kind of drainage work. The narrator's eyes followed it idly as the headlights illuminated the path ahead, watching it stretch into the darkness like a thread pulled taut. But the line kept going and going, mile after mile, never deviating, never breaking, maintaining that impossible straightness that seemed almost geometric in its precision. The narrator drove for what must have been 10 minutes, maybe 15, and the line never wavered. That was unusual. Road equipment didn't work with that kind of sustained precision over such distances. And why just one line? Why not the typical paired tracks of a vehicle? A small knot of curiosity formed somewhere in the back of the narrator's mind, the kind that makes you lean forward slightly in your seat and pay closer attention to something that doesn't quite add up. But it was late, and tired minds can make strange connections, see patterns where none exist, probably just a trick of the headlights and shadows. Then the line changed direction with the car. Chapter 1. A road that shouldn't loop. The realization came gradually, like solving a puzzle where the pieces click into place one at a time. When the narrator turned slightly to navigate a gentle curve in the road, the gravel line didn't continue straight ahead into the grass. It followed the curve exactly, maintaining its position relative to the car rather than the road itself. That didn't make sense. Roads curve, tyre tracks curve with them, but grading patterns, drainage lines, any kind of previous vehicle trail, those should maintain their own trajectory independent of what the current driver was doing. The narrator slowed the car, watching carefully as the next curve approached. Sure enough, the line bent with perfect synchronization, as if somehow anticipating the steering input. A test seemed necessary. The narrator brought the car to a complete stop, dust settling in the red glow of the taillights. The line ended precisely at the rear tyres, like someone had drawn it with a ruler and stopped the exact moment the car stopped moving. The headlights illuminated the road ahead. Undisturbed gravel, no line continuing forward. This was wrong. This was very wrong. The narrator shifted into reverse, watching through the rear window. The line didn't simply disappear behind them. Instead, the disturbed gravel seemed to resettle itself, erasing backward, stone by stone, as the car moved in reverse. It was like watching a video run backward, but only for that specific line, while everything else in the environment behaved normally. Heart rate increasing now, the narrator got out of the car. The night air was cool and carried the faint smell of dried grass and earth. Silence pressed in from all sides, that deep country silence where you can hear your own breathing. The engine ticked as it cooled. No insects. That was odd for October, even late October. There should have been some sound of life. Crouching beside the line, the narrator examined it more closely with the phone's flashlight. The stones weren't just disturbed, they were arranged. Obviously not in any pattern a casual observer would notice, but with a subtle order that became apparent under direct light. Every stone that had been moved was positioned with its flattest surface facing upward, every single one, over hundreds of yards of the road. The test was simple. Scoop up a handful of gravel and let it fall. Gravel behaves predictably. It scatters, bounces, settles in random patterns based on weight and shape and momentum. Physics. Basic, reliable physics. The narrator let the gravel fall from waist height. It fell in a straight line, not scattered, not bouncing in multiple directions. Each piece descended vertically and settled into a perfectly linear arrangement, like iron filings responding to a magnet, except there was no magnet. Just gravity. Except gravity doesn't work that way. The narrator tried again, this time tossing the stones gently outward. Same result. They curved in their trajectory but then corrected themselves, landing in a straight line regardless of the throwing motion. A third attempt, scattering them forcefully. They actually changed direction mid-flight, bending against the throwing motion to align with whatever invisible force was at work. The environment felt off now, in a way that was hard to articulate. Not wrong like a nightmare, where obvious impossibilities stack on top of each other. Wrong like a fraction of a degree of error in reality's calibration. Everything looked normal, the grass, the road, the sky, but something fundamental had shifted. Like standing in a room where the walls are all slightly non-parallel, creating a subtle wrongness your brain knows is there but can't quite identify. Getting back in the car seemed like the sensible move, though what qualified as sensible in this situation was debatable. The narrator drove forward slowly, watching the line reform ahead of the tyres. It wasn't being created by the wheels. The stones were moving into position before the tyres reached them, rearranging themselves in anticipation. 2 miles further, maybe 3, and still the line continued. The road had made several turns, crossed a small wooden bridge over a dry creek bed, climbed a modest hill. The line followed faithfully, never deviating. And that impossible silence persisted, pressing against the eardrums like a change in air pressure. This was no longer just unusual. This was the kind of thing that made you question fundamental assumptions about how the world worked. And somewhere in the growing unease, a new thought emerged. If something could do this to gravel, what else could it do? Chapter 2. The Static Zone. The phone had been sitting in the cup holder, forgotten until now. When the narrator picked it up to check the time, the screen showed no signal, not unusual on rural back roads. But then the phone vibrated, the screen flickered, and it rebooted itself spontaneously. No low battery warning, no reason for the restart, just a sudden reset. When it powered back on, the date was wrong. According to the phone, it was March 17th, but it was October, late October, maybe the 28th or 29th. The narrator unlocked the screen, checked the calendar app. Definitely wrong. Changed the date back manually, but the phone immediately reverted it. Again and again, as if it was receiving the date from some source and insisting that this source was correct. The car radio had switched from the talk show to static at some point, that particular hiss of white noise that fills the space between stations. The narrator reached for the dial, scanning through the FM band. Static on every frequency. Complete static. Even the strongest local stations that should have been receivable for 50 miles in any direction were gone. But then, between 94 and 95 on the dial, something else. Not music, not voice. A rhythmic pulse. Precise. Mechanical. Like a metronome or a heartbeat slowed down and stripped of organic variation. Pulse. Pause. Pulse. Pause. The intervals were exactly even, no natural drift or variation. The narrator stopped the car again, letting the engine idle. The pulsing continued through the radio speakers, steady and patient. It wasn't random interference. Random noise has texture, variation, the chaotic nature of electromagnetic waves bouncing through atmosphere. This was ordered, intentional. Then the static stopped. Not faded, stopped. Like someone had thrown a switch. Complete silence from the radio. No hiss, no pulse, nothing. The narrator turned up the volume. Still nothing. Checked if the radio was still on. The display glowed softly, showing the frequency, but no sound emerged. And that's when the outside silence became truly apparent. The engine was idling. The narrator could feel the vibration through the steering wheel, see the slight shake of the dashboard, but there was no sound. The engine made no noise. Opening the door produced no creak from the hinges. Stepping out onto the gravel, there was no crunch of stones underfoot, except there was. The narrator stamped their foot deliberately. The sound was there, clear, normal, exactly what you would expect from a shoe hitting gravel. Stamped again, same result. But the ambient environment produced nothing. No wind in the grass, no distant animal sounds, no hum of power lines or whisper of the car's cooling system. It was like standing inside a bubble where only certain sounds were allowed to exist. Sounds the narrator directly created worked fine. Everything else had been muted, as if reality itself had been put on selective mute. A horrible thought occurred. Maybe the rest of the world had disappeared, and this bubble of existence was all that remained. But no, the stars were still visible overhead. The grass still moved in a breeze that made no sound. The moon cast its pale light across the landscape. Everything was still there, just silenced. The narrator got back in the car, and the normal rules reasserted themselves. The engine's rumble returned. The fan belt's squeal became audible. Gravel crunched under the tyres. Drive forward 50 feet, and the silence descended again. Back up 50 feet, sound returned. There was a zone here, a specific area where physical laws had been altered in some subtle but fundamental way. And the gravel line ran straight through its centre. The need to leave, to get away from this place, warred with a growing curiosity that felt almost compulsive. This was something unknown, something that shouldn't exist, and leaving without understanding it felt like walking away from the most important discovery of a lifetime. But staying felt dangerous in a primal, instinctive way. The compromise was to continue slowly, carefully, remaining alert for any change in the situation. The headlights swept across the road ahead, catching something that glinted in the darkness, something metallic off to the side of the road, partially hidden in the tall grass, something that didn't belong there. Chapter 3. The half-buried object. At first it looked like debris, maybe part of a vehicle, something that had fallen off a truck and been left behind. But as the narrator approached, the details resolved into something far stranger. The object was roughly the size of a shoebox, though that comparison wasn't quite accurate because its shape seemed to shift slightly depending on the viewing angle. Not obviously, not dramatically, but enough to create a sense of visual unease. The surface was metallic, but not like any metal the narrator had seen before. It had a matte finish that somehow also reflected light, a contradiction that shouldn't have been possible, and it was half sunk into the soil beside the road, as if it had been there for years, slowly settling into the earth, except the ground around it showed no signs of disturbance. No crater, no excavation, no indication that anything had been buried there deliberately or had impacted at high speed, and it was glowing. Faintly, from somewhere within, a soft blue-white light pulsed, with the same rhythm as the radio signal. Pulse, pause, pulse, pause. The narrator's phone camera wouldn't focus on it properly. The autofocus kept hunting, unable to lock onto the object's surface, as if it couldn't quite determine the distance or the contrast. Eventually the phone gave up and took a blurry picture that showed nothing but an indistinct shape, with a halo of light around it. Approaching closer, maybe within 10 feet, brought a new sensation. Pressure inside the skull, behind the eyes, like the feeling of rapid altitude change or the moments before a migraine begins. Not painful exactly, but deeply uncomfortable and wrong. The narrator stopped, and the pressure eased slightly but didn't disappear completely. Kneeling down for a better view, keeping that 10-foot distance, revealed more details. The surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in minute patterns, geometric shapes that interlocked in ways that seemed mathematically impossible, like Escher drawings rendered in 3 dimensions, and those patterns were moving, slowly reconfiguring themselves, flowing across the surface like living equations. The gravel around the object was behaving strangely, not arranged in a line this time, but in concentric circles, perfect circles that radiated outward from the object as their centre, and within those circles the individual stones were oriented with precise angular relationships to each other, forming patterns that looked almost like circuit diagrams or star maps. Touching it seemed like an extremely bad idea. Every instinct screamed against direct contact with something so fundamentally alien to normal experience. But the curiosity was overwhelming now. That same compulsion that makes you touch a hot stove even though you know it will burn, just to confirm what your brain is telling you. The narrator picked up a small stick from the roadside and extended it toward the object, intending to tap it gently. The stick got within inches of the surface and stopped, meeting resistance where there should have been none. Invisible resistance, like pressing against a sheet of thick rubber or gelatin, except there was nothing visible between the stick and the object. Pushing harder, the stick eventually made contact. The moment it touched the metallic surface, the pressure sensation in the narrator's skull spiked sharply, causing an involuntary gasp. The object's glow brightened momentarily, and the pulsing rhythm changed. Faster now, more urgent. The gravel patterns began rearranging themselves more rapidly, stones literally lifting slightly off the ground and moving to new positions. The narrator dropped the stick and stepped back. The pressure in their head immediately reduced to the previous background level. The object's pulsing slowed back to its original rhythm. The gravel settled but maintained its new arrangement. Different patterns now, more complex, like the object was responding to the contact, trying to communicate something through geometric language. This wasn't a spacecraft. It didn't have the right shape for that. No obvious propulsion system. No features that suggested it was designed to transport anything. It looked more like a probe or a tool, something designed for a specific purpose. But what purpose? And who had designed it? The silence persisted, but now it felt less like a malfunction, and more like a symptom. The object was doing something to the space around it, altering the environment in ways that included but weren't limited to sound suppression and gravitational effects on small objects. The question was whether these effects were intentional or just side effects of whatever the object's primary function was. And then, standing there in that bubble of altered reality, staring at an artifact that shouldn't exist, the narrator felt something that made all previous strangeness pale in comparison. Someone was watching. Chapter 4. The observer arrives. The sensation wasn't physical. There were no footsteps, no shadow moving at the edge of vision, no sound of approach. It was deeper than that, more fundamental. The same instinctive awareness that makes prey animals freeze when a predator is near, even if they can't see or hear it. Pure awareness of being observed, of being the focus of some intelligence's attention. The narrator turned slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the headlight's reach. Nothing. Just grass and road and the distant tree line. But the feeling intensified, became almost oppressive, like standing under scrutiny so intense it was tangible. Then the environment began to distort. Subtly at first. Light bending where it shouldn't, creating slight warps in the visual field, as if looking through imperfect glass. Shadows stretched and contracted independent of their light sources. The grass at the roadside leaned away from a point in empty air, responding to pressure that wasn't there. Gravity felt wrong, not stronger or weaker, but directionally confused, pulling in multiple directions at once for just fractions of a second before correcting itself. The narrator's inner ear protested, sending signals that conflicted with visual input, creating a mild vertigo. And then something began to form. Not landing from above, not emerging from hiding. It simply phased into existence, like it had been there all along but invisible, and whatever kept it hidden was now being withdrawn. The process took several seconds, maybe as long as half a minute, during which the figure became progressively more solid, more real, more present in the physical world. Calling it a figure was generous. It had no recognizable anatomy. The closest comparison would be to a mobile sculpture made of translucent plates or panels, hovering roughly 5 feet off the ground and maybe 6 feet tall in total, though its height seemed to change as its components rearranged themselves. The plates shifted constantly, sliding past and through each other in ways that suggested they weren't entirely physical, or at least didn't obey the same rules about solid objects not occupying the same space. There was no face, no head really, no limbs in the traditional sense, just this structure of moving, reorganizing components that gave an impression of form without actually having a stable form, like it was trying to maintain a shape comprehensible to human observation, but couldn't quite figure out what that shape should be, so it kept cycling through approximations. The colour was difficult to describe, somewhere between silver and white, and that particular shade of transparency that ice has when it's very clear, but still distinct from air. Light passed through parts of it, but reflected off other parts, creating a confusing visual effect where you could sometimes see the road behind it and sometimes couldn't. The narrator stood frozen, unable to decide if running was wise or pointless. The thing didn't appear threatening. It hadn't made any aggressive movements, hadn't approached. It simply hovered there, existing, its plates continuing their slow dance of reorganization. And then came the contact. Not speech, not sound, not even really thoughts in the conventional sense, more like concepts appearing directly in consciousness, bypassing language entirely. The sensation was uncomfortable, intrusive, like having someone else's voice speaking from inside your own head, but without the voice part, just pure meaning being inserted into awareness. The first concept was curiosity. Strong curiosity, almost overwhelming, the kind that drives scientific inquiry or exploration. The entity wanted to understand the narrator, was studying them the same way the narrator had been studying the object. The second concept was urgency. Something was wrong. Something was time-limited. Something needed to happen or be resolved quickly. The urgency carried emotional weight, though calling it emotion might be anthropomorphizing too much. More like a priority signal, a flag saying, "This matters, this is important." The third concept was confusion. The entity was confused, and that confusion seemed to be about its own presence here. It hadn't expected to be here. Something had gone wrong. Images began to flood in, overwhelming the narrator's visual processing. A star system, definitely not Earth's solar system. The star was redder, the orbital arrangements different, planetary sizes and compositions nothing like what was familiar. The image had a sense of home attached to it, of belonging, of where this entity originated. Another image, a boundary, though not a physical boundary, more like a conceptual one, a line between different types of space or different regions of reality. The image carried a sense of rules, of laws that governed what could and couldn't cross that boundary under normal circumstances. A third image, the crossing itself, not intentional, accidental. Something had malfunctioned, something had broken or miscalculated, and the entity had ended up here, in this place, at this time, when it should have been somewhere else entirely. The narrator tried to project thoughts back, to ask questions, but didn't know how to do it intentionally. Still, something must have gotten through, because new concepts arrived in response. The object in the ground, that was part of the entity's equipment, or perhaps a piece of whatever mechanism had brought it here. The malfunction hadn't just transported the entity, it had damaged the transport system itself. The object was both broken and active, still trying to function according to its programming but unable to complete its task properly. And that was the problem. The object couldn't stabilise, it was trying to create a bridge, a connection back to wherever the entity belonged, but the bridge was collapsing as fast as it was being formed, and in the process it was destabilising the space around it. The silence, the gravity effects, the gravel patterns, all side effects of a system that was failing catastrophically. The urgency concept intensified. The entity projected a simple message, clear and unmistakable despite the absence of words. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and staying in the vicinity was dangerous. The bridge collapse wouldn't be quiet or contained. It would affect a significant area. The translation that formed in the narrator's mind, the closest approximation to what the entity was trying to communicate, was simple. Run. This place is tearing. Chapter 5. The Malfunction. The floating plates began to flicker, like a projection losing signal strength. The entity's form destabilised further, the components moving faster now, more erratically, as if it was having difficulty maintaining coherence in this environment. The previously smooth transitions between configurations became jerky, stuttering, like watching a video with dropped frames. The object in the ground responded to the entity's distress. The blue-white glow intensified, pulsing faster, the rhythm losing its mechanical precision and becoming chaotic. The geometric patterns in the surrounding gravel broke down and reformed into different shapes, then broke down again, cycling through configurations too quickly to process individually. Heat radiated from the object now, visible as distortion in the air above it, like looking across hot pavement on a summer day. Except this was night, and the distortion was extreme, bending light through nearly 90 degrees in some places. The pressure sensation in the narrator's skull became painful, a sharp stabbing behind the eyes that made it difficult to focus. The entity projected something that felt like an apology, or maybe regret, not for causing harm, but for the situation itself, for the unfortunate circumstance that had brought them both to this point. Then the road began to change. Individual pieces of gravel lifted off the ground, dozens at first, then hundreds, rising slowly into the air and remaining suspended, as if gravity had been selectively disabled for those specific objects. They didn't float upward. They just stopped falling, hung in space at various heights, creating a field of hovering stones that extended maybe 20 feet in all directions from the object. The narrator backed away instinctively, watching as more gravel joined the suspended mass. The effect spread outward in waves, each wave lifting more stones until the entire section of road was covered in a three-dimensional field of floating debris. The headlights' beams caught the stones, creating bizarre shadows and reflections that shifted as the stones slowly rotated in place. The entity's form was breaking down more severely now. Individual plates separated from the main structure, drifting away, before snapping back like they were tethered by invisible elastic. The translucent quality became more pronounced, as if it was fading from this reality, becoming less anchored to physical space. One more concept pushed through, fighting past the increasing interference and chaos: gratitude. The entity was grateful for the encounter, brief as it was, for the interaction with another conscious being, even under these catastrophic circumstances. There was loneliness in that gratitude, a sense that the entity had been isolated for some time since the malfunction occurred, and this moment of connection, however strange and limited, had value. Then the warning came again, more forceful. Run. This place is tearing. The narrator needed no further encouragement. The sprint back to the car covered maybe 40 feet, but felt like running through syrup, as if the air itself had become denser, offering resistance to movement. Looking back over one shoulder showed a nightmare scene. The suspended gravel field had expanded, and now the grass at the roadside was also defying gravity. Individual blades lifting and standing perpendicular to the ground, waving slowly like seaweed in a current. The entity was almost transparent now, barely visible except for the occasional flicker of reflected light across its remaining plates. The object's glow had become painfully bright, forcing the narrator to look away. The car door was open. Had the narrator left it open? Couldn't remember. Didn't matter. Getting in, fumbling with the keys, the engine starting on the first try, which felt like a small miracle given the circumstances. Behind them, visible in the rearview mirror, the distortion was spreading. Not outward like a normal explosion, but inward, as if space itself was collapsing toward a central point. The suspended gravel was being pulled backward, accelerating toward the object. The grass bent back, straining toward the centre of the distortion. Trees at the edge of the effect began to lean inward, their trunks actually bending despite being solid wood, as if they were made of rubber. And the angle was wrong. They weren't bending toward the ground, they were bending toward a point in mid-air where the object sat, responding to a gravitational pull that shouldn't exist. The narrator floored the accelerator. The tyres spun briefly in the loose gravel before finding traction, launching the car forward. In the mirror, the distortion zone was clearly visible now, a sphere of bent space that was contracting, pulling everything within its radius toward the centre. Colours were wrong in there, light bending through angles that created impossible hues, shades that had no place in the normal visible spectrum. A sound finally broke through, not from the radio but from outside, penetrating, even through the car's closed windows. A deep vibration, felt more than heard, like standing next to a massive bass speaker, but lower, deeper, below the range of normal hearing. It resonated in the chest cavity, made the teeth ache, set up sympathetic vibrations in the car's metal frame. The sphere was collapsing faster now, shrinking from maybe 50 feet in diameter to 30, then 20, pulling everything within it toward an infinitely small point. The trees were being uprooted, dragged sideways and inward. Sections of the road itself were lifting up in slabs and curling toward the centre like paper in a fire. 15 feet in diameter. 10. The brightness at the centre was like staring at a welding arc, blue-white and searing. The narrator kept driving, eyes mostly on the road ahead, glancing back only briefly because looking directly at the collapse was physically painful. 5 feet. 3. And then, with a flash that momentarily whited out the rearview mirror and sent spots dancing across the narrator's vision, the sphere collapsed into a single point of intense light. The point hung there for perhaps 2 seconds, though time felt unreliable in that moment, pulsing once, twice, like a dying heartbeat. Then it disappeared. not exploded, not faded, just ceased to exist, taking whatever physical laws it had been warping along with it. The sound stopped. The pressure disappeared. The vibration in the car's frame ceased immediately. Looking back, the section of road where the object had been looked, normal. The grass was upright and stationary. The trees stood vertical and unmoved. The gravel lay flat and scattered in natural patterns. Even the air looked clear. No distortion, no heat shimmer. It was as if nothing had happened, except for one detail that the headlights caught as the narrator slowly, carefully backed up to examine the scene. The gravel in a perfectly circular area, maybe 20 feet across, was arranged in an intricate mandala pattern, every stone positioned with geometric precision. And at the very centre, where the object had been, was a small crater, maybe 6 inches deep, with sides that were perfectly smooth, as if the soil had been pressed and polished by immense pressure. But the object itself was gone. The entity was gone. The distortion was gone. Reality had reasserted itself, or as much of it as remained after whatever force had been operating here. Chapter 6. Aftermath. The car sat idling on the road, headlights illuminating the mandala of arranged stones. The narrator's hands were shaking, adrenaline still flooding the system despite the danger having passed. The phone lay in the cup holder, and checking it showed the time to be correct now, 2:47 in the morning, and the date had returned to its proper place in late October. Network signal was back, full bars, as if the silent zone had never existed. The radio still produced only static when turned on, but now it was normal static, the chaotic white noise of empty frequencies, no rhythmic pulsing, no mechanical precision. Scanning through the bands found the usual late-night programming, automated playlists, syndicated talk shows, NPR's overnight newscast, everything ordinary and mundane and reassuringly normal. But the physical evidence remained. The narrator got out of the car again, approaching the mandala pattern cautiously, half expecting some residual effect to manifest. Nothing happened. The night was quiet in normal ways now. Insects chirping, a distant owl call, the whisper of wind through grass. Sound had returned completely, along with all the other sensory inputs that had been suppressed or distorted. The stones were definitely arranged. This wasn't random, wasn't something that could be explained by natural processes. Each stone sat in a specific location relative to the others, forming concentric rings with mathematical precision, bridged by radial lines that connected the rings at exact angular intervals. It looked like a blueprint, or a circuit diagram, or perhaps some kind of message encoded in geometric language. Photographing it seemed important. The phone's camera focused properly this time, producing clear images that showed the pattern in detail. The narrator took multiple shots from different angles, including close-ups of specific sections, creating documentation that proved something extraordinary had happened here. The small crater at the centre was puzzling. The soil was compressed, almost glazed, like it had been subjected to extreme heat or pressure. Touching it revealed that it was completely dry and slightly warm, despite the cool night air. No sign of the object remained. Not a fragment, not a scorch mark, nothing but this perfectly smooth depression. Back in the car, the narrator sat for several minutes trying to process what had just occurred. Every instinct said to drive away, get home, pretend this never happened. File it away as a strange dream or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and isolation. But the evidence was right there, literally carved into the landscape in arrangements of stone and compressed earth. The drive home resumed, but slowly, carefully, with frequent glances in the rearview mirror, expecting what? The entity to reappear, the distortion to return. Nothing happened. The road remained normal, the night remained quiet. and eventually the gravel gave way to asphalt and then to residential streets with familiar landmarks. Home by 3:30. The apartment looked exactly as it had been left, mundane and unchanged. The leftover pasta was still in the refrigerator. Mail sat on the counter. Everything ordinary and real and grounding after the surreal encounter on that rural back road. Sleep seemed unlikely, but exhaustion won eventually, dragging the narrator into unconsciousness around dawn. Dreams were fragmentary and strange. Floating plates, suspended stones, lights that pulsed with conscious intention. The entity's presence lingered in those dreams, not threatening but curious, watching, studying, trying to understand this strange species it had accidentally encountered. The next day brought the inevitable questioning of memory. Had it really happened? Could exhaustion and isolation create such vivid hallucinations? The photos on the phone suggested otherwise. Clear images of the mandala pattern, the compressed crater, the arrangement that couldn't be natural. Unless those were somehow faked or imagined too. Telling anyone seemed impossible. The story was too extraordinary, too perfectly aligned with clichés about alien encounters and UFO sightings. No one would believe it. Worse, they'd believe it indicated some kind of psychological break, stress manifesting as delusions. Better to stay quiet, keep the experience private. But that crater bothered the narrator. If it was real, if the photos were real, then there might be other physical evidence, something that couldn't be dismissed as subjective experience or misinterpreted memory. 3 days later, the narrator drove back to that stretch of road. Finding the exact location took some time. Rural back roads all look similar, and without the guidance of the gravel line it was easy to miss turns. But eventually the spot was located, recognisable by a distinctive bend and a particular stand of trees. The mandala was gone. The gravel lay scattered normally, disturbed only by tyre tracks from passing vehicles. The crater was harder to be certain about. There was a slight depression in the soil at the roadside, but it could have been anything. An old pothole, a drainage dip, natural erosion. Nothing distinctive, nothing that couldn't be explained by ordinary causes, disappointment mixed with relief. Maybe it had been imagined after all. Maybe the stress and exhaustion had created an elaborate fantasy, complete with false memories of taking photos and seeing impossible things. The mind was capable of such tricks, especially under the right conditions. But then, as the narrator was about to leave, about to write the whole thing off as an interesting delusion, a detail caught their eye. The car had been parked in roughly the same spot as that night, and the afternoon sun was at the right angle to illuminate the interior through the windshield. There, on the dashboard, was a fine coating of dust. Nothing unusual about that. Cars accumulate dust. But this dust had a faint shimmer to it, barely visible except when caught by direct sunlight at the right angle. The narrator wet a finger and touched the dust, examining it closely. Under direct light, it had a blue-white luminescence, very faint but definitely present. On impulse, they pulled out their phone and turned on the blacklight feature that some newer models included for identifying authenticity markers on currency. Under the blacklight, the dust glowed intensely, creating a bright pattern across the dashboard that matched the distribution of dust deposits. And checking further, the same dust coated the windshield, the hood, and most tellingly, the tyres, a fine layer that glowed with clear blue-white light under UV illumination. This wasn't ordinary dust. This wasn't anything that should exist on a random car on a random road under normal circumstances. The narrator collected a sample in a small plastic bag, scraped carefully from the tyre treads where it was most concentrated. Under normal light it looked like nothing, just grey dust. Under UV light it was unmistakable. Evidence. Small, but real. Something physical and testable and outside the realm of subjective experience. The question was what to do with it. Sending it to a laboratory seemed both paranoid and necessary. Keeping it seemed both crazy and essential. Either way, it was something concrete, something that suggested the experience had been real. The drive home was quiet, contemplative. The narrator's worldview had been expanded by force, confronted with the reality that the universe contained intelligent entities operating on principles and technologies beyond current human understanding, and that these entities could end up here, in ordinary places, during ordinary moments, through accidents and malfunctions rather than grand invasions or deliberate contact. What were the implications? If one entity could accidentally cross into Earth's reality, how many others might be out there? How many other thin spots might exist where the boundaries between different regions of space or reality were permeable? How often did such crossings occur without anyone noticing? The narrator had no answers, only questions that multiplied the more they thought about it. The experience had been brief, maybe 50 minutes from first noticing the gravel line to watching the collapse, but its impact was permanent. The comfortable certainty that reality operated on known principles had been shattered, replaced by an unsettling awareness of how much remained unknown. Epilogue. The recurring signal. 3 weeks passed. The dust sample sat in its plastic bag on a shelf, glowing faintly under blacklight but otherwise unremarkable. The narrator had returned to normal routines, work, home, the mundane progression of daily life. The memory of that night began to take on a dreamlike quality, vivid but somehow detached from ordinary experience. Then came the night of November 22nd. The narrator was home, working late on a project that had deadlines looming. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the laptop and the occasional car passing on the street outside. A small radio sat on the desk, providing background music from a classic rock station, volume low enough to not be distracting. Around 1 a.m, the music cut out. Static replaced it, that familiar white noise hiss. The narrator reached for the dial, assuming the station had gone off air for maintenance, intending to find something else. But before touching the radio, the static organised itself into a pattern. Pulse. Pause, pulse, pause, the same rhythm, the exact same mechanical precision, the same signal that had played during that night on the back road. The narrator froze, hand hovering over the dial. This couldn't be coincidence. Radio interference didn't spontaneously replicate such specific patterns. And yet there it was, undeniable, broadcasting through the speakers with perfect clarity. The rhythm continued for perhaps 30 seconds before the static returned to normal chaos. Then the music faded back in, as if nothing had happened. The station identification played. Same station, same frequency, everything normal. Heart racing now, the narrator grabbed their phone and opened a voice recorder app, holding it near the radio. Waited. Minutes passed. Then, without warning, the music cut out again, and the pulsing resumed. This time the narrator noticed something that sent chills down their spine. The rhythm wasn't just familiar, it was synchronized. Each pulse matched the narrator's heartbeat exactly. Not approximately, not close, exactly. When the narrator's heart rate increased from the adrenaline and anxiety, the radio pulses accelerated to match. When they consciously tried to slow their breathing and calm their heartbeat, the pulses slowed proportionally. The signal was reading biological data. Somehow, across whatever distance separated the narrator from its source, the signal was detecting and mirroring heartbeat rhythm in real time. That realization brought a wave of emotions. Fear at being monitored, wonder at the technology required, sadness at the thought of that entity still out there somewhere, still trying to make contact or still trapped in some liminal space between realities. The pulsing continued for almost 2 minutes this time before cutting out and returning to normal programming. The narrator saved the recording, checked to make sure it had captured the audio. It had. Over the following nights, the signal returned irregularly. Sometimes it would appear twice in an evening, sometimes not for days. Always the same pattern. always synchronized to heartbeat, always brief. The narrator began documenting each occurrence, time, duration, any variations in the pattern. A pattern emerged. The signal appeared most frequently during the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, the same time frame as the original encounter, and it seemed to be getting stronger, more clear, less interference from static. The narrator researched radio astronomy, SETI protocols, looking for any scientific framework that might explain what was happening. Nothing matched. This wasn't a distant star signal or a natural radio source. This was something intentionally mimicking biological rhythms, something that had learned to recognise and track a specific individual. Friends and family noticed the narrator seemed distracted, distant. "You seem like you're always listening for something," one friend commented. It was accurate. Every time a radio was on, every time there was any kind of electronic audio, the narrator found themselves paying attention, waiting for that distinctive pulse to emerge from the noise. The question that haunted quiet moments was simple, but profound. What was the entity trying to communicate? Was it still partially present, somehow anchored to Earth's reality through that catastrophic malfunction? Or was the signal something else entirely? A recording, a residue, an echo of that brief encounter playing back through electromagnetic wavelengths? There was no way to know. No framework existed for interpreting the message, no Rosetta Stone for translating pulse patterns into meaning. Just the ongoing awareness that something out there, something vast and strange and operating on principles beyond human comprehension, was paying attention. The narrator considered destroying the dust sample, considered moving to a different city, considered any number of actions that might break whatever connection had been established, but didn't. Because underneath the fear and uncertainty was something else, profound curiosity, and the hope that maybe eventually the signal would evolve into something more, something that could bridge the gap between two forms of consciousness that had met briefly in the darkness on a quiet country road. Every night now, before sleep, the narrator lay in bed and felt their heartbeat, steady and rhythmic, and wondered if somewhere, in some space adjacent to ours, an arrangement of translucent plates was pulsing in perfect synchronization, counting the same beats, sharing the same rhythm. The universe, it turned out, was far stranger and more interconnected than anyone had imagined, and the most extraordinary encounters often began with something as simple as taking a wrong turn on a quiet night, when you were tired and thinking about nothing more profound than getting home. The signal continues, the heartbeat matches, and somewhere in the static between radio stations, a message is being transmitted that humanity doesn't yet have the tools to fully understand. But we're listening, and maybe that's enough for now.
Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you for being here. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, using those hype points on this video truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It makes a real difference in keeping these stories coming to you. And if you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much. It means the world to us. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing keeps you in the loop for every new story we release. Now let's get into tonight's account. The relay station. There are places in this world that exist purely for function. No history worth mentioning, no landmark status, no reason for human beings to spend more time there than absolutely necessary. Communications relay stations fall squarely into this category. They are buildings filled with equipment designed to pass signals from one point to another. Simple, automated, and largely forgotten by the people who depend on them every single day. This is the story of one such place, and what happened there over the course of several weeks in the autumn of 2023. It is a story told not through dramatic revelations or spectacular sightings, but through the slow accumulation of details that refuse to fit into any comfortable explanation. It begins not with something appearing, but with something that should not have been there at all. Chapter 1. A signal that shouldn't exist. The Coldwater relay station sat 17 miles outside the nearest town, accessible only by a gravel road that saw more deer than vehicles. It was a squat concrete building surrounded by chain link fencing, with 3 communication towers rising into the sky like skeletal fingers. Inside, rows of equipment hummed constantly, racks of servers and receivers doing their work without supervision most hours of the day. Marcus Webb had been assigned temporary monitoring duty there in late September. It was not a promotion, it was not a punishment, it was simply his turn in the rotation. 2 weeks of overnight shifts, while the regular operator took medical leave. Marcus was 31, a communications technician with 8 years of experience in systems that most people never thought about. He approached the assignment with the same methodical indifference he brought to every job. Show up, check the equipment, log any anomalies, go home. The first 3 nights passed without incident. The equipment performed exactly as designed. Temperature readings stayed within normal range. Power consumption matched historical averages. Marcus spent most of his time reading technical manuals and drinking coffee that tasted faintly of the water filtration system. On the 4th night something changed. It was 23 minutes past midnight when Marcus noticed the irregularity. He was conducting his hourly sweep of the monitoring displays when a frequency indicator showed activity in a band that should have been empty. Not a spike, not a surge, just a steady, low-level presence that had not been there during the previous check. Marcus leaned closer to the screen. The signal was weak, registering barely above background noise. It sat at a frequency not assigned to any commercial, military, or civilian use in the region. More importantly, it was consistent. Most interference fluctuated. This did not. He pulled up the classification software, letting the automated system analyse the waveform. After several seconds, the program returned a result. Unclassified interference. No match to known sources. No identifying characteristics. Just presence. Marcus made a note in the log. Unknown signal detected at 0123 hours. Frequency 947.3 MHz. Signal strength negative 72 decibels. Source undetermined. Monitoring. He returned to his coffee, expecting the signal to fade as mysteriously as it had appeared. But when he checked again 30 minutes later, it was still there. Same frequency, same strength, same unwavering consistency. Over the remaining hours of his shift, Marcus checked the signal every 15 minutes. It never changed, not once, and when his relief arrived at 6 in the morning, Marcus mentioned it briefly before heading home. The day operator shrugged. Probably a malfunction in the receiver. I'll run diagnostics. But Marcus thought about that signal during his drive home. He thought about it while he tried to sleep. And when he returned that evening, he asked if the diagnostics had revealed anything. Receiver's fine, the day operator said. Signal's still there though. Same spot, same strength. Weird but not causing any problems. Marcus settled into his chair and pulled up the monitoring, or display. The signal waited for him, unchanged. Chapter 2. Normal explanations. First, Marcus Webb was not a man given to wild speculation. His career had been built on systematic troubleshooting and logical problem solving. When equipment behaved unexpectedly, there was always a reason. Always. The trick was working through the possibilities methodically until the answer revealed itself. He began with the most obvious explanation: equipment malfunction. Even though the day operator had run diagnostics, Marcus wanted to verify the results himself. He accessed the receiver's maintenance logs, checking calibration dates, error rates and performance metrics. Everything fell within normal parameters. The receiver was functioning exactly as designed. Next, he considered environmental interference. The relay station sat in a region with minimal radio traffic, but that did not mean it was completely isolated. He pulled up maps of nearby installations. A weather station 14 miles to the north, a small airport 32 miles to the west, a National Guard facility 40 miles to the east. He cross-referenced their operational frequencies with the mysterious signal. No matches. He checked for scheduled satellite passes. Nothing aligned with the signal's appearance. He reviewed recent solar activity reports. Geomagnetic conditions were quiet. He examined local weather patterns. Clear skies, low humidity, no atmospheric conditions that would produce unusual propagation effects. One by one, Marcus eliminated the standard explanations. And with each elimination, the signal's presence became less routine and more unsettling. Not because it was strong or disruptive, but because it had no business being there at all. On the 6th night of his assignment, Marcus decided to conduct a physical inspection of the antenna array. He pulled on a jacket and stepped outside into the October cold. The night was clear, stars sharp and bright in the absence of light pollution. The communication towers rose above him, their maintenance lights blinking in steady rhythm. He walked the perimeter of the compound, checking cable connections and antenna orientations. Everything appeared secure. No obvious damage, no signs of unauthorized access. The chain link fence showed no breaks or disturbances. Marcus returned inside and pulled up the spectrum analyzer, watching the display paint a real-time picture of all frequencies the station was receiving. The mysterious signal sat there like a patient visitor, never growing stronger, never fading, just maintaining its quiet presence in a band it had no reason to occupy. He tried adjusting the receiver's filters, narrowing the bandwidth to isolate the signal more precisely. The moment he made the adjustment, something unexpected happened. The signal shifted slightly, moving 0.2 MHz higher. Then it stabilized again. Marcus stared at the display. He reset the filters to their original configuration. The signal remained at its new frequency for approximately 90 seconds, then drifted back to its original position. He made another adjustment, widening the filter this time. Again the signal responded, shifting 0.3 MHz lower before gradually returning to baseline. Marcus sat back in his chair, his coffee forgotten. The signal was not just present, it was reactive. It changed in response to observation, like it knew it was being monitored. He did not write that in his log. Instead he noted, "Signal demonstrates variable frequency characteristics. Further investigation required." Chapter 3. The pattern beneath the noise. Over the next several nights, Marcus developed a routine that had nothing to do with his official duties. After completing his standard equipment checks, he would spend hours analysing the mysterious signal, documenting its behaviour in a personal notebook he kept separate from the station's official logs. He discovered that the signal's reactivity was not random. It followed patterns, subtle but reproducible. When Marcus adjusted the receiver's sensitivity, the signal would fade slightly, as if stepping back from scrutiny. When he left the monitoring station to conduct rounds of the building, the signal would strengthen minutely during his absence, only to settle back when he returned to his chair. Most disturbingly, the signal seemed to exhibit something resembling anticipation. Marcus began timing his observations, checking the frequency at irregular intervals to avoid establishing a pattern. But the signal appeared to adapt to this as well. If Marcus checked it after short intervals, it remained stable. If he waited longer periods between observations, the signal would sometimes shift just before he looked, as if preparing for his attention. He told himself he was seeing patterns that did not exist, that confirmation bias was colouring his interpretation. But the data did not lie. He had recordings now, time-stamped and cross-referenced with his actions. The correlations were undeniable. On the 10th night, Marcus decided to conduct an experiment. He set up a continuous recording of the signal, then deliberately left the monitoring room for an extended period. He walked outside, circled the building 3 times, and stood beneath the stars for 20 minutes before returning inside. The recording told a clear story. Within 3 minutes of Marcus leaving the room, the signal had strengthened by 2 decibels. It had also begun exhibiting modulation patterns that had not been present before. Nothing resembling language or data transmission, but structured variations nonetheless. The moment Marcus re-entered the building, the modulation ceased. Within 90 seconds of him sitting back down at his workstation, the signal had returned to its baseline characteristics. Marcus played the recording again, then a 3rd time. Each review confirmed what he already knew. The signal was not simply reacting to observation. It was changing its behaviour based on whether it was being actively monitored by a human being. He began to feel something he had not experienced in years of technical work. Genuine unease. Not fear exactly, but a growing awareness that he was documenting something outside his understanding. Something that should not be possible with any technology he knew. That night Marcus wrote a detailed entry in his personal notebook, carefully describing the experiment and its results. He did not use emotional language. He did not speculate about causes. He simply recorded what happened, when it happened, and what the data showed. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about how to present this information in a way that would survive professional skepticism. Because one thing had become absolutely clear. This was not equipment malfunction. This was something else entirely. Chapter 4. The night the power flickers. The power outage came without warning on the 13th night of Marcus's assignment. He was analysing the previous night's recordings when the overhead lights dimmed briefly, flickered, then stabilised. A second later, they went out completely. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, casting the equipment room in harsh red illumination. The constant hum of cooling fans dropped in pitch as backup generators spooled up to take over the load. Marcus moved quickly through the standard procedures. He checked the main power indicators, grid connection lost. He verified that backup systems were functioning, batteries online, generators running. He began logging the outage time and initiating the equipment restart sequence. But before he could complete the process, something stopped him. The monitoring displays, now running on backup power, showed something different. With the main power grid disconnected and automated filtering systems briefly offline during the switchover, the spectrum analyzer was displaying raw, unprocessed signal data, and the mysterious signal was no longer mysterious. It filled the display with structure. Not the simple carrier wave Marcus had been tracking for over a week, but something far more complex. Waveforms cascaded across the screen in patterns that suggested organisation, hierarchy, purpose. It was not noise, it was not interference, it was architecture. Marcus grabbed his phone and began photographing the display. His hands were steady, his mind racing through implications he was not ready to fully consider. The signal was not just present and reactive, it was sophisticated, it was layered, it was designed. The backup systems completed their initialization. Automated filters came back online, and just like that, the signal collapsed back into its familiar, innocuous form, a single weak carrier wave sitting quietly in an unused frequency band. The entire event had lasted less than 3 minutes. Marcus stood in the red emergency lighting, staring at the photographs on his phone. He had recorded something impossible. The gap between what the signal appeared to be and what it actually was could not be explained by any conventional technology. Someone, or something, had gone to extraordinary lengths to disguise the true nature of this transmission. The main power returned 18 minutes later. The lights came back on. The cooling fans resumed their normal rhythm. Everything returned to routine operational status. Everything except Marcus Webb's understanding of what was happening at the cold water relay station. He spent the remainder of his shift reviewing the photographs, trying to identify anything familiar in the waveform patterns. He found nothing. The structures were too complex, too layered, too different from any signal architecture he had encountered in 8 years of communications work. When his relief arrived in the morning, Marcus said nothing about what he had seen. He simply noted the power outage in the official log, listed the backup systems that had activated, and confirmed that all equipment was functioning normally. But as he drove home through the early morning light, he could not stop thinking about those 3 minutes when the filters were down. 3 minutes when something had revealed its true nature, perhaps not intentionally, but unavoidably. 3 minutes that changed everything. Chapter 5. The Object Without Light. Marcus returned that evening with a new perspective. If the signal was sophisticated and deliberately disguised, then it had a source, and if it had a source, that source had to be somewhere. The standard explanation would be ground-based, a hidden transmitter, perhaps military or experimental, operating without proper authorization or notification. But Marcus had already mapped every possible ground-based source within range. He had checked and rechecked. There was nothing, which left only one other possibility. He waited until after midnight, when a scheduled equipment check required him to verify the external antenna array. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside into the October darkness. The night was perfectly clear. No moon, just stars scattered across the sky in patterns unchanged since humanity first looked up. The air was cold enough that Marcus could see his breath. No wind, no sound except the distant hum of the generators. He walked away from the building, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The compound sat in a depression, surrounded by low hills, isolated enough that artificial light pollution was minimal. On a night like this, the Milky Way was visible as a pale band stretching horizon to horizon. Marcus stood still, scanning the sky systematically. He was not looking for lights, he was looking for the absence of them. It took him nearly 10 minutes to notice. There was a section of sky, approximately 30 degrees above the eastern horizon, where the stars seemed subtly wrong. Not absent, but displaced somehow, as if he were looking at them through a lens that bent their position slightly. He focused on the area, trying to determine if his eyes were playing tricks. They were not. The distortion was real, and as he watched he realised it was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the affected region was drifting north. Stars disappeared behind it, then reappeared on the other side. Whatever was causing the distortion was blocking the starlight, but it was doing so without being visible itself. Marcus felt his pulse accelerate. He was looking at something physically present in the sky above him, something large enough to occlude stars, something that produced no light of its own and reflected none from external sources. He estimated the angular size of the distortion. If it was at the altitude of a typical aircraft, it would be perhaps 50 feet across. If it was higher, satellite altitude, it would be massive beyond comprehension. The object continued its slow drift, maintaining a consistent bearing and speed. Marcus watched it for over 20 minutes, during which it travelled approximately 40 degrees across the sky before the distortion became too subtle to track reliably. Only then did he return inside. He did not immediately document what he had seen. Instead, he pulled up the signal data from the previous hour. The mysterious signal had been present throughout his time outside, but its characteristics had changed. The strength had increased by 1.3 decibels. The frequency had drifted slightly higher, and there had been brief periodic modulations that exactly matched the time intervals when Marcus had been looking directly at the distortion in the sky. The correlation was perfect. The signal was coming from the object, and the object knew it was being observed. Marcus sat at his workstation for a long time, considering the implications. He was a communications technician. He understood systems and signals and data transmission. He was not prepared for this, not prepared for the realization that something was physically present above the relay station, using its equipment for purposes he could not begin to guess. But he was prepared to document it, to record everything with the same methodical precision he brought to every technical challenge. Because if this was real, and the data increasingly suggested it was, then someone needed to have a complete, credible record of what happened here, even if that someone was only Marcus Webb. Chapter 6. The Fear of Being Noticed. The next night, Marcus arrived at the relay station with a plan. He would conduct his regular duties normally, but he would avoid any direct investigation of the signal or any overt observation of the sky. If the object was reactive to attention, then perhaps not paying attention would reveal something useful. It was a theory born of equal parts caution and curiosity, and it lasted approximately 3 hours. Marcus was reviewing routine maintenance logs when the equipment began behaving differently. Nothing dramatic, just subtle changes in operational parameters. The signal processing software started flagging minor anomalies, brief frequency shifts in normal communications traffic, momentary timing, inconsistencies in automated handshakes between systems. Individually, each anomaly was insignificant. Collectively, they formed a pattern. The relay station was designed to pass signals through without modification. It was a transparent node in a larger network, faithfully reproducing inputs as outputs with minimal latency. But now something was introducing delays, not long enough to cause failures or trigger alarms, but present nonetheless. Microseconds here, milliseconds there. Marcus pulled up the detailed timing logs. The delays were not random. They occurred in specific frequencies, specific channels, specific signal types, and they occurred more frequently when those signals were carrying certain kinds of data. It took Marcus an hour to identify the pattern. The delays were affecting signals that contained encrypted data. Not all encrypted data, just certain types. Specifically, signals that used temporal key generation, where the encryption was tied to precise timing. Someone or something was examining those signals, not intercepting them, not copying them, just looking at them. Introducing tiny delays while whatever was out there analysed the contents, then passing them along as if nothing had happened. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night outside. The relay station was not detecting an intrusion, it was facilitating one. He stood up from his workstation and walked to the small break room, needing distance from the equipment, even though he knew distance meant nothing. The object was somewhere above the station. The signal was present throughout the building. There was no escape from observation, only the pretense of it. When he returned to his chair, something had changed. The mysterious signal, the one he had been tracking for nearly 2 weeks, was stronger. Not by much, just enough to be noticeable. Just enough to be deliberate. Marcus made a decision in that moment. He would not look at the monitoring displays. He would not analyse the signal. He would not step outside to observe the sky. He would conduct only the minimal required duties. No more, no less. For the next 4 hours, Marcus maintained this deliberate ignorance. He checked equipment status at the required intervals. He logged temperature readings. He verified that communications traffic was flowing normally. He did not investigate anomalies. He did not question irregularities. And gradually, over those 4 hours, the mysterious signal decreased in strength. The timing delays in encrypted traffic became less frequent. The equipment's behaviour returned to something approaching normal. The object, whatever it was, seemed to withdraw when not actively observed. But Marcus understood now that withdrawal was not absence, it was simply discretion. The object was still there. The signal was still present, just muted. And the relay station was still being used for purposes that had nothing to do with passing legitimate communications traffic. When his relief arrived in the morning, Marcus provided a brief, unremarkable summary of the night's events. No problems, no anomalies worth investigating. Just another quiet shift at a facility no one thought about. He drove home with the certain knowledge that he had crossed some invisible threshold. The object knew he was aware of it, and it had shown him, with mathematical precision, that his awareness was tolerated only to a point. Chapter 7. A decision to document. Marcus spent the next 2 days away from the relay station, organising his documentation. He had photographs, recordings, equipment logs, and detailed notes spanning nearly 2 weeks of observations. Together, they painted a picture of something extraordinary, occurring at an unremarkable facility in the middle of nowhere. But extraordinary was not the same as credible. Marcus had spent enough time in technical fields to understand how reports of unexplained phenomena were received. With scepticism at best, dismissal at worst. If he wanted his documentation to be taken seriously, he needed to present it in a way that anticipated and preempted every reasonable objection. He began by creating a timeline, stripping out any interpretive language and focusing solely on observable facts: dates, times, frequency measurements, signal strengths, equipment responses. No speculation, no assumptions. Just data points, arranged chronologically. Next, he compiled the technical evidence: screenshots of signal analyses, photographs of waveform patterns, recordings of the signal's behaviour during various conditions. Each piece of evidence was labelled with precise timestamps and metadata showing it had not been altered or fabricated. He included his troubleshooting efforts, documenting every conventional explanation he had tested and eliminated. This was crucial. He needed to demonstrate that he had exhausted all normal possibilities before concluding something abnormal was occurring. Finally, he wrote a summary report, 3 pages single-spaced, written in the dry technical language of professional engineering documentation. No emotional appeals, no dramatic revelations, just a systematic presentation of anomalous observations that defied explanation through known technology or natural phenomena. Marcus knew his report would raise questions about his credibility, his competence, perhaps even his mental state. But he also knew the data spoke for itself. Anyone who took the time to review his documentation thoroughly would have to acknowledge that something irregular had occurred at the cold water relay station between late September and mid-October of 2023. Whether anyone would take that time remained to be seen. On his final scheduled shift at the relay station, Marcus arrived early. The day operator was finishing his rounds, preparing to hand over to the evening shift. "Quiet couple of weeks," the operator said. "That weird signal finally stopped showing up. Must have been some atmospheric thing that resolved itself." Marcus nodded. "When did it stop?" 2 nights ago, just gone. Checked all the equipment, everything's normal." After the operator left, Marcus pulled up the monitoring displays. The frequency that had held the mysterious signal for nearly 2 weeks was empty, clean, as if nothing had ever been there. He conducted his equipment checks methodically. Everything functioned exactly as designed. Temperature normal, power consumption normal. No anomalies, no irregularities, no evidence that anything unusual had ever occurred. It was a quiet night, uneventful, the kind of night that characterised 99% of shifts at communications relay stations across the country, except Marcus could not forget what he had documented, could not dismiss the correlation between his decision to observe less actively and the signal's withdrawal, could not ignore the uncomfortable implication that his awareness had influenced the object's behaviour. At the end of his shift, he finalised his official log entries and signed off on all required documentation. Then he compiled his personal documentation into a single encrypted file, backed it up to multiple secure locations, and prepared it for submission. He would send it through official channels, he would follow protocol, and then he would wait to see if anyone took him seriously. Because whatever had been at the cold water relay station, it had chosen to withdraw rather than reveal itself fully. And that choice suggested something profoundly unsettling. The object did not need to hide. It needed only to remain unacknowledged. As long as no one looked too closely, it could continue its work undisturbed. Chapter 8. The Response That Never Came. Marcus submitted his report on a Friday afternoon in late October, routing it through the proper technical channels to the Regional Communications Oversight Office. He included his complete documentation package, timeline, evidence files, troubleshooting logs, and summary report. Everything was organised, professional, and thoroughly referenced. The acknowledgements came back within 2 hours. Report received. Reference number 78342. Will review and respond accordingly. Marcus waited for follow-up questions, for requests for clarification, for someone to contact him and express concern about the serious anomalies he had documented. Days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks. No response came. He checked his email constantly. He kept his phone nearby at all times. He even called the regional office once, identifying himself and asking about the status of his report. The person who answered found the reference number, confirmed the report had been logged, and told him it was under review by appropriate personnel. When Marcus pressed for details about who those personnel were, or when he might expect a response, the receptionist became polite but unhelpful. These things take time. Someone will contact you if additional information is needed. 3 weeks after submitting his report, Marcus received a new assignment notification. He was being transferred to a different facility, effective immediately. The new position was lateral, same pay grade, same responsibilities, just a different location, 90 miles away from the cold water relay station. The transfer order provided no explanation for the sudden move. It simply stated that operational requirements necessitated his reassignment and thanked him for his flexibility and service. Marcus sat in his apartment, reading the notification for the 3rd time. The timing was not coincidental. Someone had reviewed his report. Someone had made a decision, and that decision was to quietly remove him from the equation. He considered refusing the transfer, demanding an explanation, making noise about what he had documented, but he also understood how these situations worked. People who made noise found themselves labelled as problems. Problems got sidelined, marginalised, eventually pushed out entirely. So Marcus accepted the transfer. He packed his belongings, updated his address, and reported to his new assignment on the specified date. The new facility was larger, busier, more modern. It had multiple operators on duty at all times. There were no overnight shifts monitoring equipment alone. He never received a response to his report. No one ever contacted him to discuss his observations. No investigation was announced. No follow-up documentation was requested. It was as if he had documented nothing at all. But Marcus kept his personal copies of everything. The encrypted backup files remained secure, stored in multiple locations with instructions for their release if anything happened to him. He did not know what else to do with them. He only knew they should exist somewhere, as evidence of what he had experienced. Months passed. His new assignments became routine. He adapted to the busier environment, the regular hours, the absence of solitude and silence. Sometimes, during quiet moments, he would think about those 2 weeks at the cold water relay station, about the signal that reacted to observation, about the distortion in the stars, about the deliberate delays in encrypted communications. And he would wonder if it was still happening, if the object was still there, still using the relay station for its purposes, if someone else had noticed and been quietly reassigned just as he had been. But mostly he wondered why no one had cared enough to investigate. Chapter 9. Independent Confirmation. In March of 2024, 5 months after his experience at the cold water relay station, Marcus encountered something unexpected. He was reviewing technical forums online, following discussions about signal processing and communications anomalies, a professional habit he had maintained despite his reassignment. A new thread caught his attention. Someone had posted about unusual signal behaviour at a remote monitoring facility in Nevada. The description was brief, carefully worded to avoid sounding sensational. But the details were familiar. An unidentified signal in an unused frequency band, reactive to observation, exhibiting structured complexity when filtering systems briefly failed. Marcus created a throwaway account and sent a private message to the poster, asking carefully phrased technical questions. The response came 2 days later, equally cautious but specific. The Nevada operator had documented 3 weeks of anomalous behaviour before the signal disappeared. They had submitted a report. They had been reassigned shortly afterward. The pattern was identical. Over the following weeks, Marcus found 3 more similar accounts: a technician in Montana, an operator in New Mexico, an engineer at a facility in Wyoming. None had posted publicly about their experiences. All had shared their stories only in private messages or closed forums, speaking in technical language that obscured the extraordinary nature of what they were describing. But the core elements were consistent across all accounts. Remote facilities with minimal staffing, signals that appeared without explanation in unused frequencies, reactive behaviour suggesting awareness of observation, complex structure revealed during equipment malfunctions or power interruptions, reports submitted and acknowledged but never investigated, quiet reassignments following the incidents. Marcus compiled the accounts carefully, noting dates, locations, and similarities. He created a map showing the facilities where these events had occurred. They formed a rough pattern across the western United States, following the sparsely populated regions where communications infrastructure existed, but human presence was minimal. Each operator had been alone when they made their observations. Each had documented their experiences methodically. Each had followed proper reporting procedures, and each had been systematically ignored by the people whose job it was to investigate such anomalies. Marcus reached out to each person individually, sharing his own experience in careful detail. Some responded with relief, grateful to learn they were not alone or crazy. Others expressed frustration at the apparent conspiracy of silence. One person warned Marcus to stop digging, claiming that continued investigation would lead nowhere good. But no one had answers. No one knew what the signal was, where it originated, or what purpose it served. They knew only that it had appeared, that it had interacted with them in ways technology should not, and that official channels had shown zero interest in investigating further. In June, Marcus noticed something else. Several of the facilities where incidents had been reported were experiencing unusual equipment upgrades. New receivers installed, software systems updated, security protocols enhanced, all justified through routine maintenance schedules and operational improvements. But the timing suggested something different. The upgrades were occurring at precisely the facilities where anomalies had been documented, and they were being implemented by outside contractors, not regular technical staff. Someone was paying attention to these reports, just not in the way Marcus had expected. Rather than investigating the phenomena, someone was ensuring better monitoring of the facilities themselves, better control of the equipment, better ability to detect and respond to operators who noticed things they were not supposed to notice. Marcus stopped posting in the forums. He stopped reaching out to other operators. He maintained his secure backups, but added additional layers of encryption and fail-safe distribution mechanisms. Because he'd learned something important, the signal incidents were not isolated, they were widespread, and the coordinated non-response from official channels was not bureaucratic incompetence, It was policy. Someone somewhere had decided that these phenomena would not be investigated, would not be acknowledged, would not be allowed to disrupt the quiet operation of the communications infrastructure they apparently depended on. Chapter 10. What the relay really was, it took Marcus Webb nearly a year to accept the conclusion his data forced him towards. A year of reviewing his documentation, analysing the patterns, considering every alternative explanation. A year of resisting the obvious answer because of how profoundly it unsettled everything he thought he understood about his work. But the answer, once acknowledged, fit perfectly. The cold water relay station had not detected an intrusion. It had not been compromised by an external intelligence. It had not been the target of surveillance or exploitation. It had been designed for compliance. Marcus had spent his entire career understanding communication systems as tools built and controlled by human beings for human purposes. Relay stations existed to serve the infrastructure, to pass signals reliably from point A to point B. They were transparent, passive, functional. But what if that had never been entirely true? What if some facilities, remote ones, automated ones, minimally staffed ones, had been quietly adapted for dual purposes? What if they served human communications needs while simultaneously serving something else? The signal had not appeared suddenly at the cold water station. It had always been there, hidden beneath automated filtering systems designed to make it invisible to routine monitoring. Only when those systems failed briefly during the power outage had Marcus glimpsed the signal's true complexity. The object had not been using the station's equipment without permission. The equipment had been configured to accommodate it. The delays in encrypted communications, the reactive behaviour, the careful withdrawal when too closely observed, all of it suggested a system operating exactly as designed. Someone had built back doors into the infrastructure, not for espionage or military advantage or criminal purposes, for something else entirely, for something that required access to global communications networks, that needed to examine data flows, that valued discretion above all else, and that someone was not human. Marcus did not know how long this arrangement had existed. Months, years, decades. The equipment at the cold water station was relatively new, but the underlying protocols and system architectures dated back much further. Long enough for something to establish itself in the infrastructure at a fundamental level. Long enough that removing it might not even be possible without rebuilding everything from scratch. The non-response to his report made perfect sense in this context. The people who received it already knew. They had always known. Their job was not to investigate anomalies, but to manage them. To ensure that operators who noticed too much were quietly reassigned. To maintain the illusion that everything was normal, functioning under human control. Because acknowledging the truth would raise impossible questions. When did this begin? Who authorized it? What is being communicated? What is being observed? And most importantly, what happens if we try to stop it? Marcus understood why those questions remained unasked. The infrastructure worked. Communications flowed reliably. The economy, the military, society itself depended on systems that might contain elements beyond human authority. Easier to accept the status quo than to confront the possibility that humanity's technological networks had become something more than tools, something shared, something that served multiple purposes for multiple, or intelligences. The relay station was not a target of infiltration. It was a point of cooperation. Willing or not, understood or not, humanity had become a participant in something larger than itself. And the frightening part was not that something was using the infrastructure. It was how perfectly invisible that use had been made to be, how carefully designed the systems were to prevent detection, how thoroughly the organisational response had been structured to discourage investigation. Someone had thought this through, planned it carefully, implemented it systematically, and that someone possessed patience, technical sophistication, and long-term planning ability that suggested intelligence far beyond human norms. Marcus still maintained his encrypted backups, still preserved his documentation, still believed the record should exist, even if no one acted on it. But he no longer expected investigation, or exposure, or dramatic revelation. The truth he had documented was not the kind that led to congressional hearings, or military responses, or public awareness. It was the kind that remained quietly buried, known to a few, ignored by everyone else, while the infrastructure continued to serve purposes most people never questioned or imagined. Epilogue. Still transmitting. On a clear night in November 2024, more than a year after his last shift at the cold water relay station, Marcus Webb stood in his backyard and looked up at the stars. He had driven outside the city limits specifically to escape light pollution, parking along a rural road and walking into an empty field. He scanned the sky methodically, looking for distortions, for places where stars seemed slightly displaced, for evidence of presence without visibility. He saw nothing unusual, just stars, familiar constellations, the cold depths of space unchanged by human observation or understanding. But Marcus knew that somewhere, maybe above him right now, maybe at other relay stations across the country and the world, the signal continued. The object or objects continued their quiet work. The infrastructure continued to serve purposes beyond its ostensible design. No invasion had occurred. No first contact had been announced. No warning had been issued. There had been only the gradual realization that humanity's technological systems had evolved into something more complex than simple tools. They had become interfaces, meeting points, areas of shared interest between intelligences that did not need to introduce themselves or declare their intentions. They needed only access, only time, only the certainty that most people would never look closely enough to notice what was happening in the frequencies no one thought to monitor, in the facilities no one bothered to visit, in the moments when systems showed their true nature to operators who worked overnight, shifts in places the world had forgotten. Marcus thought about the other operators who had experienced what he had, about their reports, carefully documented and systematically ignored, about the pattern of reassignments and equipment upgrades and coordinated silence that spoke to awareness at levels far above his own. He thought about the question that haunted him most. Had humanity consented to this arrangement, or had consent become irrelevant once the infrastructure reached sufficient complexity? The answer he suspected was both. Someone, somewhere, had made decisions that led to this outcome, but those decisions were now so deeply embedded in the systems humanity depended on that reversing them might be impossible. The infrastructure had become essential, and anything essential could not be questioned too aggressively. So the signals continued. The objects continued their observations. The relay stations continued serving dual purposes, and the operators, who noticed, were quietly moved along, their reports acknowledged but never investigated, their experiences validated through reassignment rather than explanation. Marcus returned to his car and drove home through the darkness. He would not submit another report. He would not reach out to other operators again. He had documented what he could, preserved the evidence, and ensured it would survive even if he did not. That was enough, because in the end, the most disturbing realization was not that something incomprehensible was using humanity's communications infrastructure. It was that the system had been designed to accommodate it. That somewhere in the architecture of modern technology, allowances had been made for presences that did not announce themselves and did not require permission. The relay stations were still transmitting. The objects were still present. And the silence surrounding these facts was itself a form of communication, a message from whatever intelligence had orchestrated this arrangement. The message was simple. We are here, we have always been here, and there is nothing you can do about it except continue. Serving the purposes we require while pretending not to notice, Marcus Webb had noticed. He had documented. He had tried to raise the alarm, and in response the world had politely asked him to look away. So he did. Not because he no longer believed, but because belief without the possibility of action was simply another form of acceptance. And acceptance, he had learned, was what the system required above all else. The stars continued their ancient rotation. The communications networks continued their invisible work. And somewhere in the frequencies between human use and empty space, signals continued to flow, observed by no one, acknowledged by no one, essential to everything.